So this is being videotaped. Just hope everybody knows that. That's what I've heard, at least. I'm the moderator, Annie Murphy, and I'm profuse sweater, and also a bit of a adrenaline junkie. So I deal with panic attacks and agoraphobia, and my friends refer to me doing these kinds of things where I go from Portland to New York and speak in front of a group of people as agoraphobia Olympics. So if anybody else also deals with social anxiety, I just want to say this is a social anxiety safe space. If you need to walk out that door at any moment, you can. If you want to come back, you can. And we're going to have sort of a loose style where if you really, really need to ask a question, like right then, you can. So let us know, raise your hand, just be like, oh, over here, like you would in class. Otherwise, I'm going to ask these guys a few questions, and we're going to ask each other questions, and then we're going to open it up to a more broad discussion, I hope. And so Diane was supposed to be here, but who knows? There's a lot of things that come up in folks' lives. I wasn't even sure if I was going to be here until about 5 minutes ago, and
she'll be like Elijah.
So she may speak. Yeah. Should we introduce ourselves first, or should I introduce why I was asked to do this? Should I? Yeah, I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
Jen Camper asked me to do this presentation. I felt like it was exciting because for the first time I felt like I was being noticed for the whole of what I was doing with comics. I came into comics from sort of a zine angle. I was writing zines about my mental health about 10, 12 years ago in Portland, and there was kind of a radical mental health survivor movement going on around that time, and a lot of it started in the UK, so it was called Mad Pride, but I would just kind of write about my mind and what was going on and put images in there and give the zines out to people. And when I started doing that, it really just completely changed my world. All these people came up to me and said, I had no idea this is what was going on, and you're talking about something that I really relate to, and it really helped me survive, helped me get through that period of life. So soon people were like, why don't you do comics? Your zines look like comics, you draw and you write. And that's when I did start to do comics, but I came at the comics from a less personal perspective. I like to do sort of biographical pieces that about people that I relate to. But it was about a few years ago that I realized I had to start doing comics more about the physical disabilities that I was dealing with, because I couldn't keep them separate anymore. It was starting to feel like I had separated those two worlds, and I needed the people in my comics world to know a little bit more about what was going on with me. And I started getting obsessed with this idea of why art helps people survive, and survival in general. And then, of course, because I'm comics obsessed, I started studying graphic narrative throughout the years, thousands of years ago, and sort of historical graphic narrative, murals or the biotapestry, things like that, and found that there were all these stories of memory and stories of people that had passed and stories of sort of trying to survive this narrative that wasn't really being told in words. It was different with pictures. It was more like a people's narrative. And then I started thinking, when I was doing some teaching in a comics class, that I started noticing that all the big, heavy-hitting graphic novels these days, Fun Home, Persepolis, and Mouse, things like that, are also sort of survival stories of memory, stories of kind of trying to almost encapsulate a difficult aspect of life. And I think Jen noticed that a lot of my work had to do with mental health, being crazy. I call it crazy. I know crazy can be used as a disparaging word against people, but I've gone through different labels for myself, and I like crazy because it's good and bad. It just is. It ain't awesome. It ain't terrible, but it's a good word for it for me. So I'm going to be using that word. I might use it a lot. I'm curious. My first question was going to be for Diane, but she's not here. And it had to do with...
Should we introduce ourselves?
Yes,
or
yes.
Were you going to introduce us?
Well, I was going to as we went, but let's go.
Okay.
Let's do it down the line right now.
Oh.
Yeah, introductions.
Right, okay.
And
Hi.
you introduce yourselves.
Okay. I'm Ellen Forney. I guess the main thing that I have to offer here is that I wrote Marbles. Okay, I have a copy. Marbles. Mania, Depression, Michelangelo, and Me. And it is my experience with bipolar disorder, my bipolar disorder, pretty much mostly taking place between my diagnosis right before I turned 30, the 4 years after that, which was a real struggle to become stable. And then I also talk about other writers and artists through history who had mood disorders, and then also really dealt with, researched a lot, studies that correlated mood disorders and creativity. Because really the kind of, one of the big overall themes was how it affected me as an artist. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Because, yeah, more than I'm going to ask you about that.
My name is Rupert Kinnard. I've been a cartoonist for quite a number of years. I'm very honored to have been invited to be here. I'm totally blown away by the fact that there's so many of you in this room. I thought this panel would probably be the least attended panel in the conference. I consider myself, one of the reasons I think I was invited to be a part of this is that I feel like I'm a poster boy for intersectionality. I don't consider myself disabled. I consider myself less abled because it's not like I'm not able to do anything, but I'm certainly less able to do things. Before I was in an automobile accident and in my wheelchair. Just as recently as last night, I think the effects of being disabled in this society was very evident to me a couple of weeks ago when I tried to book a hotel here for the conference. Every time I book a hotel, I'm looking for a wheelchair accessible room. So I booked a room at the Bucknor Hotel and felt that that was one part of my trip that was squared away, and found out a couple of days later that they did have wheelchair accessible rooms, but the hotel itself wasn't wheelchair accessible.
Oh, God.
It was the most bizarre thing. I called them and they said, no, we have 5 stairs to get into our hotel. So so much of, I think, what I like to do in my work is just kind of draw parallels between the different ways that we all are, challenged in our lives. And to that end, one of the things that is a kind of a summation of my entire career as an artist is this project that I'm working on, and it's called the Life Capsule Project. And the whole idea is that it talks about the struggles to integrate the different challenges that I've had in my life. I've been described by someone as a person who has 3 strikes against him. And I don't really think of it that way. I think that I've certainly been presented with a triple whammy in terms of, at certain periods in my life, coming to grips with what it's like to be African American in this culture, and coming to grips with what it's like to be gay. And then later on in my life, when I had my accident, I had to come to grips with what it's like to be disabled in this culture. And unfortunately, I keep collecting challenges because now my hearing is failing me, my hair is falling out, and I'm getting older. So I'm just very happy to be here and just thrilled that there's so many of you here to listen to what we have to say.
So glad to hear, Rupert.
Thank you.
So my name is MK Czerwiec. I make comics and I'm a nurse, and so I go by Comic Nurse because when you see my last name spelled, it's Czerwiec, and no one wants to deal with that. So I started making comics in around 2000. I had been a nurse on an AIDS unit in Chicago, and towards the end of that time when the unit was closing, it was sort of a summation of grief, and I was trying to figure out how healthcare providers really try to cope with what we bear witness to, and words were not working and images were not working, and one day somehow I just started making a comic and it worked. And so I kept doing it, and so I've been doing comics from a place of need since then. So then I got to a point where I wanted to make them better, and I thought, well, I could either learn how to draw, which I thought.
You didn't need to know how to draw. You don't even know how to draw in comics.
That'll come together eventually. I'll just keep going and see what happens. But then I decided I wanted them to be informed by, since my comics were about my experiences as a healthcare provider and life in general, I also wanted them to be informed by this field that I'd learned about called the medical humanities, which takes the humanities and applies them to the context of medicine. And so a very concrete example of that is bioethics, is philosophy applied to medicine, right? So there's literature in medicine and history in medicine. I knew that I wanted to make comics about this AIDS unit that I worked on because it was a very unique, special place, and I thought there's a lot to be exported for healthcare generally. And then as time has gone on, I realized there's also a history that a lot of young people don't even have a sense of how bad it was. And so but I also had my experience as a healthcare provider, and as I mentioned, how do people who bear witness to so much suffering go on and deal with that? So I wanted to kind of bring all this in a new comics with a form. So I studied medical humanities, and I'm telling this story because right at the end of my degree, I sort of kept it kind of quiet that I was making comics. Like I was going to be a serious scholar, and I was going to study, scholarly ways. And I was secretly at home making comics about like the history of medicine, and I thought they were hilarious. But I was in the right program at the right time. I was at Northwestern in their medical school, it has a medical humanities program, and they got it, I think, before even I did, the power that this could be a thing. And then I came across Brian Feist's book, Brian Feist's graphic novel called Mom's Cancer. And if you've ever heard of it, it's tremendous. And it was definitely world-changing, and it made me, at the end of my degree, bring the comics to the forefront and ask this question: could comics have a serious place in healthcare? And by absolute coincidence, and not that I believe in coincidence, but synchronicity, that was happening also in the UK. There was a doctor who was getting a degree in medical humanities also because he wanted to combine art in his medicine. And he also found Mom's Cancer. Believe it or not, this all happened in a parallel course. And said at the end of his degree, maybe I'll just have a conference and see who shows up. And from that has risen this movement called graphic medicine. And it's the intersection of comics and medicine. And everyone who shows up at our annual conferences says, I thought I was the only one in the world doing this. And hundreds of people have come from all over the world, literally, every continent, who have been using comics in medicine. And so it's a thing, and it's really exciting. And so I'm partly here to talk about that. I co-run this website, graphicmedicine.org. And just this month, we are releasing the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, which is a book about why comics are valuable in healthcare, but also more broadly in how we think about the world. And the most exciting thing is that it starts with a 20-page comic about the manifesto, and then there's chapters by smarty pants people, and then there's excerpts of comics on medical themes. So it serves as sort of an anthology as well as a manifesto. And at the back there's panels by tons of people who are involved in the community that bear witness to the ways in which graphic medicine can take place in scholarship. And the most important ethic, I think, of graphic medicine, just to get this last point across, is that every voice is of value, and the people best situated to speak to the experience of illness and caregiving are the people experiencing it, not the medical establishment, not medical illustrators. That we can create the iconography of illness, and we can speak to what it means.
Can I?
Yeah.
I spoke at the last conference, which was at Johns Hopkins, and it was amazing. Like, I was one of those people who I was just like, I had no idea there was anything like a movement, and going, and there was these hundreds of people. It was like, my people, it's amazing. It was our Burning Man, I think. It was basically. It's serious, right? Right? There was all this energy. It was like,
And Kay, that was one of the things that I was wanting to, and you as well, Ellen, because you've been involved in the comics and medicine, is just point out just how uncouth it's been so far to actually let the experiencers speak the story, right? And I was going to ask you to elaborate on that part there. How has it been, and also for a doctor, like you said, to be doing comics and to be doing art about their work even. I mean, there used to be a time in history where I feel like, maybe half of us in this room might have been institutionalized because of the artwork we do. There's this idea of outsider art, and I've studied a lot of that in the art brut movement and these different things, and it was separate. It was the crazy person doing the amazing art, and then it was the doctor studying them. And I feel that because of modern culture and like a lot of ways that things have been integrated more or structures have been broken down, it's not as easy to keep separate anymore. And I'm curious to just explore that, and also to move over into your book, Ellen, with Marbles. You've done a lot of autobio stuff in the past, and then I started getting even more familiar with your work when you illustrated Sherman Alexi's book, the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Midwife. The first part always gets me. And I'm wondering how they compare, because Marbles is this sort of expose of like visually explaining to your reader your experience of specific bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. I was curious, was there something about working on somebody else's project that made you feel like you had to just get real personal with your next one, like in a way that maybe you hadn't before?
Well, the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian is a young adult book by Sherman Alexie, a Native American writer and poet who lives in Seattle, who I had known earlier. He liked my work, and he was the one who asked me to be a part of that. And the story is about, it's very closely autobiographical for him, about a high school-aged boy living on the Spokane Indian Reservation who transfers to a white school nearby, and just all of the different racism and classism and alcoholism and like racism on both sides. And so there was a lot of tough issues and a lot of very emotional issues. And the one part that Sherman was was a cartoonist. He wanted the character to be a cartoonist. So he asked me to basically be his cartoonist brain and hands. So I really had to, and it's rare that I collaborate, but Sherman is pretty amazing. So, and it was a really involving story. But so what I was doing was I was channeling this really difficult story and making comics out of it. So like figuring out what the absurd parts were, and okay, if I'm Junior, like what is it that I have to get out, and how do I do it? And I used a lot of different drawing styles. Like I would sketch as if I was drawing from a photograph, and I would do, I came up with, and a lot of it I wrote myself as well, like cartoons and then annotated illustrations. And one of the places that I was really drawing from was my own experience getting my feelings out, writing in journals, sketching in sketchbooks. That was the pieces that went into Marbles. Mm. So it was kind of, I didn't do it consciously, but I was very aware when I was doing Marbles, like, oh, that specifically was what I was inspired by, or where I was coming from, why I knew that I had to do it this way. So in Marbles, I used my photographs of my sketchbooks.
So let's see.
I have a photograph of one of my sketchbooks.
Yes, it's actually very.
Yeah. So this was from my depression sketchbook. So this was part of my. This is when I was going through my deepest depression, hopefully the deepest depression I will ever experience. And it was the end of the year, 1998. And so that's me with this banner around me, 1998, and there's vomit and meds, and then there's the, kind of like the baby, like how you see those depictions, like the baby, 1999, and there's like the safety pin is poking, and it says, Phoenix-like, Ellen rises from the ashes of, I can't even, of
Ocean.
1998.
Ocean 1998.
I don't know. It's, but basically coming up with this, and figuring out how to make it funny and getting it outside of me. I think that humor is one of the most important tools that I have in dealing with things that are difficult. And also one of the most important tools that I have for allowing me to tell somebody else what it's like without them having to put up their defenses.
Speaking of humor, I really dug the crazy merit badge panel. Was that that seems like something that you could come up with while writing a young adult book. Anyone who's been on meds, very often it will have been a series of meds. I know a friend of mine who has bipolar 2. She said, "Yeah, I have a drawer full of meds," and it's like our battle scars. It's like, I'm trying so hard. Are you impressed by what? We're trying to almost shock somebody else by our list of meds. And so I knew that I wanted to write down all the different meds that I'd been on. I'd been on, Depakote and Celexa, and I have a couple pages of that. But I wanted to make it funny somehow, so that it wasn't just look, I have this, and what a pain in the ass this was, and to have sympathy for me. So, but then also actually kind of make it positive. Like, yeah, it was tough, and so they're merit badges, for having to having to cut your pills and taking side effect meds. Somewhere later, I mentioned another merit badge, taking side effect meds for your side effect meds. It's like you check that one off. And so that's a way to kind of turn it around and be like, yeah, right. Totally. And yeah, well, I have one more kind of vague question, but specifically around mental health and comics. I saw on YouTube a brief interview with Phoebe Bucknor. I don't know if people know her work, but it's very influential in my life and very censored in the world. And she's starting to get a little bit more respect, a little more play. But she said, somebody was asking her, why do you do comics? Because she also does medical illustration and a bunch of other things. And she, she had wild eyes, and she said she's twitching a lot, and she said comics is really the only thing that, with my ADHD, that she can take all these parts and all this chaos that's going on, and there's something, it's almost like 7 people are doing the work while you're doing comics, because you have to think all these layers, and you have to be in the future and you have to be in the past. And for her, it sounded like the way that people describe people playing video games, like young people, if they have problems with their attention, that they could just really focus on video games because there's a billion things going on at once. I'm wondering, how did your bipolar disorder lend itself to doing comics?
I don't know that it was my bipolar disorder specifically. I would say that it's the way, my creativity, it's how I express myself. It's where my creativity goes. I love to write, and I love to do art. One of the things that I talk about with when I talk with people about reading comics and what the comics language has to offer is the specificity of the words. You can say, very, very specific things. And then there's the symbols that we all recognize, like the word balloon, and we know that you're saying something. But then there's the drawing style, which gets an emotional impact, which gets a certain tone and a certain mood that the words don't. And so I usually describe that as a reading experience, that you all get that you get all of those messages at the same time. That it's a very thorough reading experience. But on the other side, as a creator, I also get that experience that I can pin certain things down that are very specific with words, and I in the way that I draw, I can explore how things feel. Like I do that. Like how did this feeling look? Was it like really solid black? Was it scratchy? It's one of the reasons that Marbles has so many different drawing styles in it. Like some of it are like big and to be simplistic about it, like like Marble, the mania is more like big and loopy, and the like depression is much more stark and in grids, and from there.
That reminds me, I feel like I've found that I can convey a lot more information about my disabilities through monsters than actually talking to people. Like, I've had people just come up and say, God, the monsters in your comics, I just got it, I got who they were and why they were surrounding you. And to me, it was the funny part of the story. It was like the silly, like cartoony part. Right. And that was sometimes what really moves people, because it's speaking in a language that we all recognize in a way.
Well, and then there's also metaphors. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate. You had the one that you just showed with the carousel.
Yes.
So you can do visual metaphors as well. So it's specific information, but then also, like you were saying, like that monster as a visual metaphor for the way that you're feeling. Right. It can also be a different way to explain something.
Right.
Well, in an efficient use of space. I mean, you imagine in text how much it would take to convey this information, and I use this in presentations all the time as a healthcare provider. This is an extremely efficient presentation of information.
You use this?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's an extremely efficient use of presentation of information, right? That explains a lot to us and explains a lot to everyone. Tremendous.
Okay. I'm going to do a big jump. That's rad. That's awesome.
Okay.
And ask you, Rupert, if you can tell us who the brown bomber is, and Diva, and the Diva. Those two characters. Those are characters of yours, right?
When I was really young, I was really into superhero comic books, and I was involved with. I enjoyed reading DC comics, which their featured heroes were Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and then I graduated to the Marvel superheroes, and those were like Spider-Man, Daredevil, Fantastic Four. And when I was young, I used to draw those heroes, and that's how I learned that I could draw.
Do you want me to start with this yet? Should I wait on this?
No, this is fine. Okay. This is just the beginning of what was going to be a presentation. For me, this was a quote, and I don't remember where I found it, but to bring about social change, we must share our stories. And that's what's happening here, and I think it's what's going to be happening throughout the conference. And so my story involves those superheroes that I was drawing when I was younger. And so I was drawing Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and Daredevil, and at one point, I realized that none of those characters reflected my own reality. So I started creating my own superheroes. Excuse me. And the first one that I created was, I created a character called Superbad, and he was kind of the opposite of Captain America. He was a black militant superhero. And then after that, I decided to create the Brown Bomber, who was a kinder, gentler superhero.
No, can I ask you about that? What made you want to change the character you were working with from the militant to nice?
I like to believe that it's part of that pendulum that we go through when, in the beginning, the reaction to being marginalized in the society is to go the militant route. And then my desire I think sometimes then you go from the one end of the spectrum to the other. And for me, the other end of the spectrum was almost like Superbad embracing the philosophy of Malcolm X. And then I felt like I wanted to go to this other extreme, which was Superbad not only represented Malcolm X, but he represented Muhammad Ali for me. I wasn't into Muhammad Ali as a boxer, but I was into him as, someone who really affected me by his attitude that he was the greatest. So the Brown Bomber more so represented the boxer Joe Louis, who was quite a hero for African Americans during the 30s and the 40s. And Martin Luther King's philosophy. So the idea of the Brown Bomber was still a superhero, but I was amused by the idea that there was other fictitious characters like fairies. So I wanted to create a superhero that was a combination of a superhero and a fairy. So there's a superhero with the powers of a fairy. And so I had a number of adventures with the Brown Bomber. First published in my college newspaper in the mid-'70s. And one of the greatest experiences I had with him as a published character was that there was a African-American student union, and we wanted to raise money for a scholarship fund. So I had the Brown Bomber printed on 300 T-shirts. And he was just almost became the school mascot. Because he was in the paper every week, and we had these T-shirts. We sold 300 T-shirts to raise money for the scholarship fund. And after all the T-shirts were sold through a series of cartoon strips in the newspaper, I slowly had the Brown Bomber come out as a gay character. So I felt like I was being very subversive. All of these school administrators and professors were running around with their Brown Bomber T-shirts, and I said, "Oh, he's gay." So at some point, I really wanted. I moved from. I went to school in Iowa, and I moved to Portland, and I really felt like the Brown Bomber needed a best friend, a best buddy. So I ended up creating Diva Touche Flambe. And the whole idea with Diva was that she was to embody all of the great qualities of the women in my life. And it was just so wonderful knowing that it was a way to pay tribute to all of these different aspects of what I felt were the great qualities that women shared with me in my life. And so the two of them as a team in the cartoons just made for some very interesting comic strips.
This one, the Cathartic Comics, this big one, is that how they showed in the weeklies? Was that a week?
Yeah, that was kind of, that particular cartoon was like an origin cartoon.
Oh, okay, I see. And my question is, compare and contrast your older work with your most recent, the Life Capsule project.
Well, I was invited to be a part of this panel, I think, because I am less abled, but I realized that the span of most of my career as a cartoonist, I was an able-bodied person. But when I started working on the Life Capsule project, which literally I've been working on for 15 years, there's obviously a main chapter in the book deals with when I went through my accident in Mississippi. I was on a 2-lane highway. I had traveled from Portland to a small town in Mississippi for my grandmother's funeral. And the day after her funeral, I was in this auto accident. And so the idea of the work that I'm doing now, everything that happens in our lives, I think we reflect on them and we try to figure out how they intertwine with one another. And so when I became confined to the wheelchair, it was like this perfect opportunity to examine my whole approach in life and what I thought of being in a wheelchair. So it was this interesting balance between knowing that I had explored what it was like to be African American in this culture, and then gay, and then once I found myself kind of in this new body, I had to figure that out. So one of the cartoons, the series of strips that I did.
Is this in your?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's like a couple of slides before that. That's the punchline.
Okay,
So yeah, that's the first one.
Do you want me to read it? Do you want me to?
Sure.
Or do you want me to? With the celebration of Black History Month, I'm sure you, as an African American gay male, are really examining the discrimination that you face because of your race much more than your sexual orientation, right? Okay, let's see.
No way, I bet you're still overwhelmed by the hardships you face as a gay man, which must be much worse than anything you experience as a black man.
He's wrong. People are much more racially insensitive to you as a person of color, huh?
He doesn't know what he's talking about. Homophobia is your biggest cross to bear, isn't it? Before I address this issue with you both, could you please stop using it? So I just love embracing the opportunity. There's all of these situations where you're asked those questions. Isn't it worse for you in this culture to be African American the way you're treated? The interesting thing about becoming paraplegic was that as much as I didn't want to compare those situations, the wheelchair trumped everything. It was I wouldn't have ever imagined it, but you have these situations where you're among all gay people, and you can experience racism. You're among black people, you could experience homophobia, but the wheelchair thing, I just feel as if I get it from all kinds of directions. So I just really feel pulling together so much of what I've learned being in these different marginalized communities. It has been so worthwhile to explore, especially because I think I came out on the good end of that, these kinds of challenges. And that's what I really wanted to do in the book. It's really a celebration of integrating all of these things. I don't think of life as a series of ups and downs, goods and bads. I think of life as a series of challenges and adventures. So this is only a prototype of the book, and I'm hoping to get it published. And it's really unfortunate because I think a lot of us, we have that creative urge and we want to express ourselves in a creative way. But then in terms of getting published, you have to get in contact with this other part of yourself. You have to become a promoter and you deal with trying to get people to want to publish. I presented to publishers and agents, and they wanted to be something else. One person says, "Oh, it's not enough of a graphic novel." Someone else says, "Oh, if you make it more like a graphic novel, it'll work." So the challenge, obviously, is to find someone who shares your vision.
Definitely. Is that book? Is it? Would you say it's an autobiographical book, or is it like chapters?
It's totally biographical. Except when I approached the project, I couldn't write it. I could not write it because I kept feeling, as biographies are, they are self-centered. But I kept thinking, I can't do it. I can't do it because it's all about me. But at the point that I realized, I have the Brown Bomber Diva, let them tell the story. And from that point on, the creative floodgates just opened, and I was able to really complete it to the point of needing to be proofread and edited. But other than that, it's really my vision as to how I wanted to present, my life and the challenges I've gone through, the challenges and adventures. And I think the adventures have been, really great. But not to take up too much more time.
Well, and there's a segue here. Oh no, but what is it? That's it.
I went through my accident. It was really kind of a trying period, obviously, but never was I depressed or down, because at every point I had this community. Generally, my community, I live in Portland, Oregon. My community is really, really varied in terms of ages, race, sexualities, genders. But when I went through my accident, I couldn't get to a point of any kind of sadness or depression because my community kept supporting me and my partner. At no point was I able to experience any negative feelings, because every time they approached us, I was more touched by their support. But in the midst of that, I was actually in the hospital going through a physical, going through just the change. I got a package in the mail, and it was from Alison Bechtel. And there was a little note, and she said that she wanted to send me a get well card. And then she wanted to send the card to other different cartoonists to add to the card. And the idea got bigger and bigger and bigger. So what she ended up doing was asking each cartoonist to send a panel, a get well panel, to a fellow cartoonist. At this time, I really was as aware as I was of the warmth of the African American community and communities of color and allies and the gay community. I had never really realized that I was a part of a cartoonist community until then. So Allison got together with all of these cartoonists, and each of these cartoonists sent panels. All of these were in one package.
Oh my God.
And I just thought this conference was one of the best times to share
There's notes.
with folks what it's like to be a part of this community, the cartoonist community, lesbian and gay cartoonist community.
Whoa, thank you for bringing
as you
this.
can
I heard the
imagine,
story, but
I was just
my
really,
God.
really overwhelmed by it.
Oh wow.
And so I just shared this with you to let you know that this is one of the reasons I'm just so proud to be in this conference. And this is just such an example of what a powerful community that we're a part of. But this sits in my house. Thank you. Even the cartoonists that were a part of this, they've never seen this total
You'll have
display,
to show this
so.
again. Later on this,
Yeah.
sometime, like as many times as possible.
Yeah, I think it would be good to just display.
It's kind of terrifying to touch them. I'm like, these are relics by my heroes. Wow. Thank you for bringing that. Yeah, and I was latching on to something you were saying about the contrasting private life of a cartoonist and the need to promote yourself. I think I heard some groans from the audience and things. I'm curious how an idea like marbles became published, like actually published. Your book. Like, how did you get? Yeah, did somebody know that you were working on this personal story? Like, was it because? Do you feel like because you'd had other books published that you had the freedom to do something, new or like?
Well, the book that I did with Sherman opened a lot of doors. It got a National Book Award, so that was kind of like it's kind of like.
So you'd recommend that, getting a national book?
Yeah. So it made it easier for me to hook up with an agent who was excited about my work and liked the idea, and it was also still on the, graphic novels were like I guess it wasn't necessarily, it was on the tail end of the wave of like, everyone was, like all the publishers are like, oh, there's this new thing, graphic novels. It was
Wait, they aren't
early,
still?
mid.
I was kind of hoping
Well,
that
actually, I mean, it's still a bit of a curiosity. There are some imprints that are like, this graphic novel thing, we kind of want to give that a go, So there's that. But I get the short answer would be that I have an agent who is awesome, who I
Okay, that's
love.
important.
A
lot of us coming from in DIY, independent publishing, that seems like a little bit far-fetched, especially, if you're also, I don't know. I started thinking about it this way recently. I got a lawyer to help me get disability 15 years ago, and I had to wait a year and a half to get on it, and they don't want to give it to you. They don't really believe you. They believe a lawyer that says you're actually disabled. So it took me getting this free lawyer to actually get get compensated, win the case or whatever. And I keep thinking about it. That's my only reference for this agent thing, because to me, agents are like, they come and they tap you on the shoulder and they say, I'm your fairy godmother, and that seems almost mythical.
But they don't tap you on the. I mean,
they don't. That's what I want to know.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is that you present your work to them or to a lot of agents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's part of. I mean, the door doesn't just open.
Right.
And I had already put out a lot of books with Fantagraphics Books,
right,
which is a small publisher in Seattle. So I had already. Well, I guess they're a bigger publisher now, but I was in Seattle in the mid '90s, which was Seattle was comics town.
You're coming up with
it was kind of a mecca, and so it was all part of that. I mean, there are tons of different stories, right? I mean, for a while it was San Francisco. Seattle has its own thing. Portland for sure has an amazing comics scene. Yeah. There are a lot of cartoonists that are doing really interesting things. There are very different avenues now. The webcomics are huge, and those are a way for people to get their work out there and get a following. And if you can say this many people are fans of mine, then it's more likely that you'll get a deal. Or some people make their money doing webcomics.
Uh-huh.
No, my work for me has been really personal. So I'm really fascinated by the work that you guys are doing, and I just was wondering if you would even talk a little more about how you some of the experiences you've had, kind of stepping outside of yourself, using your work for other people.
Definitely.
Oh, did you want to show some images?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good.
I know. I'm getting all absorbed in talking to you guys.
This is. The graphic medicine work and the graphic medicine manifesto is about using comics in healthcare, as I mentioned, and kind of creating that community. And really, also, we've really been really inspired by what an amazing and empowering community it is.
I got your images, and then I also had some images already. So
okay, great.
If you have specific ones, tell me.
So how about Comic Nurse 2 there?
Okay, Comic Nurse.
Bottom. It's underneath my logo, so that's my avatar.
Sorry.
That's okay. So backing up. As I mentioned, I knew that I wanted to do this comic. I wanted to do a graphic memoir about this age unit that I worked on, and it was called Unit 371. And when I originally went to do some research, I found that, for example, in New York, there were several AIDS units here, and there's archives in the library. I just heard recently that St. Anthony's Hospital, or there will be a park dedicated, if anyone knows anything about this, to the AIDS unit that was, I guess, the hospital.
St. Vincent's?
St. Vincent's, thank you, yes. Yeah, and so there's like a park dedicated in San Francisco, and someone maybe could speak to this. I know there's definitely an archive in the library, because you think about all the archival documents that would happen in an AIDS unit where thousands and thousands of people came through, hundreds of people died in rapid succession. And yet in this AIDS unit, which was probably the main, certainly out front, dedicated AIDS unit for the entire middle of the country, the Midwest, was in Chicago, there was absolutely no historic record. There was no history written anywhere that it existed. And so that was a burden I somewhat felt a little crushed by, because I felt like then that felt like this enormous, just representing AIDS at all, but then this enormous burden. So I realized that it's sort of this weird hybrid of I can tell my story because I can't represent anyone else's story. I can tell my story of what it was like to be a caregiver there, but there was also so much that I didn't know. So as part of my degree, I did an oral history of this place. So I interviewed family and patients and caregivers and people that came through. And I wanted to, but back on that slide.
Oh, that side.
Yeah, so that slide. So this is, so the first time I walked on this unit, so I'm graduating as a nurse. Backstory of how I got there doesn't matter at this point, but those are the elevator doors opening, and the first thing I see is Broadway show posters on a hospital unit, and I thought, this is where I need to be. And what I want to convey visually, and then also, again, this aesthetic of the patient being front and center in the experience was what I wanted to convey visually in these comics. And so there you have like a lounge where you have just a caregiver hanging out. This is a place where caregivers just hanging out having meals with patients. And just in these visual images, I want to convey what's so different. Now, these aren't what you're used to seeing images about hospitals, right? And so using that as a launching point to go forward. So then you can go to the other slide. So then I had this challenge of I'm telling my story, but then I'm also integrating patient stories, and all of I'm doing three things. I'm telling my story, I'm integrating patient stories, and I'm including the oral history that I did. So the oral history, obviously, I have their words. My patient stories, I don't. And so all of my patient characters are hybridization of several different stories that happened, but that I was part of. And I'm not telling their story, I'm telling my story. But anyway, so I just included this image in terms of representation. So I also was up against this thing of you've got something so tragic and so, in many cases, visually disturbing, but yet look at my style. It's this kind of crazy, childlike, 8th grade girl style. And so I've sort of taken about 5 years trying to navigate that craziness. But I continue to move forward. So that is, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's sort of what I'm trying to do. We work with the skills we have and the story we have to tell, and we do it the best we can. And so that's...
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a sidebar. It's really kind of a sidebar. So we were talking about, I just went down to was just at the National Library of Medicine down in Bethesda, and I'm doing a project with them about comics and medicine. It's not going to be all put together for a couple of years, but it's going to be traveling to libraries, mostly medical libraries. It's going to be amazing. I had a chance to look at their collection, and they have a ton of comics that were handed out. The Gay Men's Health Crisis did a lot in the late 80s, kind of like those tracts, like those Jack Chick tracts, but they were like, they were really explicit about safe sex. They were all about safe sex. And they were actually really, a lot of them were really beautifully drawn. It looked very Tom of Finland. And then there were tons of, but then there were also tons of safe sex comics and informational. I was really and what they sent me as a PDF before I went down there. It was great. I didn't manage to get you slides of those, but if you're curious,
It's okay.
They don't have them cataloged really well online. And obviously I couldn't take some, but if you're interested in seeing any of that, I have some PDFs and some of the images, if that's something that interests you. And they're like, she was like, share it with whoever you want. I was like, can I share it with people? And she was like, it's to share it, do it. So show it wherever you want. It's like public.
And I'm curious, so when you say comics and medicine, and then we say graphic medicine, and then there's the Comics and Medicine Conference.
It's all the same thing.
Okay, it's all the same thing?
And
Or
narrative
is it now a
Narrative
theme?
medicine is like literary theory and using like the illness narrative. So graphic
maybe
medicine is
explain
narrative
the
medicine in
difference.
comic form. Yeah.
So wait, could you break down like the differences that you're talking about? Or just
I think that's the
you
only
just
one.
did.
Not that it's different. It's all part of the same thing, but yeah, narrative medicine is like actually Columbia here has the the kind of one of the
No, what? What is it?
Narrative medicine would partly just be text. It's
Oh,
just
okay.
like text-based memoir, right? So So graphic medicine.
So is graphic medicine being accepted in the way that narrative medicine would be, or is this like a brand new? I want to move into sort of talking about the graphic medicine conference and how you guys, teamed up, or your experience with it, and just what it means that those walls are breaking down between patient, consumer, whatever you want to call it, and provider, caregiver, those kind of things. Because that's what's really struck me when I started hearing about this, is that people I knew that were, experiencing disorder or physical illness or disability were being invited to this conference and being considered experts. And then there were doctors that happened to be comic artists too that were considered experts. And I mean, that's just mind-blowing to me. That's like a huge new paradigm shift. And to me, I'm like, wow, comics can do that too. Like when Jen's talking about, and just about this conference in general and what queer comics have been doing, as far as there being like all kinds of intersecting marginalized communities within queer comics. Rather than like butting up against those publishers that say you're a niche, sort of thing. We're kind of creating this on its own. What do you think what do you see the impact so far on the medical community of your work with the graphic medicine? And then I want to ask Ellen specifically what you did.
I think that there's almost been, interestingly, a sigh of relief. So that's one reaction. There's a lot of them. That's one of them. In that, one of the things that motivates me in everything I do is this idea that really, the working title for my book is called Taking Turns, because we're all people taking turns being sick, right? The division between healthcare provider and patient is just a matter of time, right? And AIDS blew that wide open because AIDS destroyed all those boundaries. Our patients and we're our caregivers, and the people in the hospital were our patients at times. And the people who worked in the so that that was that really taught me that lesson. And so that's carried over into this comics work, I think, and people breathe a sigh of relief because it's a moment in which academics can recognize that they have an origin story of why they care about what they've been spending their whole life working on, right? And they can be upfront about their honest personal experience and stop hiding behind their, academic expertise. Mm-hmm. Same thing for doctors. Like my colleague who did this book with me, Ian Williams, his graphic novel that is releasing here in the United States is called The Bad Doctor. Mm-hmm. And he talked about having OCD and how it impacted his, it's a thinly veiled memoir. Those are his words, so I'm not revealing anything. And that he talks about, experiencing OCD and how it's, interacting with patients. And so it's about, I think, a lot of ways it's interesting. It's about breaking down boundaries. And, one of the best stories that I heard was that there was a woman who will be at our conference in Toronto who had done this amazing comic about being inpatient in a psychiatric care unit. And she submitted to speak at our conference and then came and sat down at the table and looked out and realized that there were like a whole bunch of psychiatrists in the audience. Yeah. And she's the patient speaking to, and has shown very graphically her experience. And she said, she suddenly just was gripped with terror. Like, oh my God, what did I do? What am I here representing? And then she said that what was so incredible was how well received it was and how she found this medium to be finally the way to be able to speak to the people who were speaking for her, and then start shifting that dynamic and realize that, have them step up and go, yeah, you should be speaking for yourself. Like what, And so that kind of thing is just, again, breaking down boundaries.
Do you think there's a way that people accept that sort of thing from artists? Like, in a way that, like, almost... Because I think about like Linda Berry and stuff and the things that she has tackled in her work. And when she spoke to us at a school I was at, she came and she said that she makes comics to keep herself from killing herself and other people. I would never have gotten that from these beautiful holographic pictures. But just relating that to the magic that artists hold.
And in terms of like, how is it responding? I mean, Ellen, you'd said our last conference was at Johns Hopkins, right? Like that.
I
right
love
there.
saying that.
Right? I know.
I thought that people were like comics and medicine. I was like,
tell me about
Johns
that.
Hopkins.
The establishment really has embraced it.
Yeah, tell us about that as a cartoonist, getting to rub elbows with the medical elite.
Well, it was medical and academic, and it was it
All
was
over the board?
No, it was one of the things that I was hoping for with Marbles. One of the, I mean, graphic novels. It's funny, we were talking about the terminology, and it really just kind of reflects how limited it is still seen as.
Really
like this
a
is like,
novel,
well,
right?
it's a graphic memoir. But if I say a graphic memoir, people are like, I say it's just a graphic novel. And they're like, oh. Right? And,
It's really
Marbles is not shelved with my bookstore is psychology and all of the, and they have bipolar memoir, but you're not going to find Marbles there.
No?
Marbles isn't,
It's
you're
just
not
in
going to find anywhere. I'd be very surprised.
Interesting.
I mean, it's the same
I
thing
think
with
we should all the stores and move it.
and I don't mean that to be complaining about where Marbles is placed. I just mean that as a general issue that it's. I think that we can all see that it's getting accepted as a literary medium, but not trusted enough yet, I think, for information to be part of science. And still just sort of like, it's getting into, I was just like, but wait, there's courses in colleges and everything, but they're writing classes, they're literary classes. So, I mean, one of my dreams is that this is going to be in a Psych 101 class, and I haven't heard that yet. I haven't heard that yet. And so, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe not.
Yeah.
What? It seems to me that there is a growing awareness that treatment of the fact that there are active humanities classes in med schools. I think that's pretty new. Or like really active, respected ones. That the model of the doctor knows what's going on and sort of like imposes that on the patient. That there's this increasing awareness that the doctor is a human being, and that the patient is a human being, and that there is a human relationship going on. That for the doctor to understand what's going on within the patient, there has to be a lot more work that's going on. That it's a physical, social, emotional, psychological kind of thing. You were talking about that with all of the different issues that come into play about your your health, right?
Totally.
And feeling like a well-rounded person, that you are accepted and accept yourself. And so I think that a lot of that actually comes together in graphic
Comics.
in comics.
And you were going to ask me, and I would love to open it up.
Yeah, just the last thing I was going to say, one thing that is really powerful about, and that is being used as a textbook in medical school classrooms. And that is one thing that's being really subversive and wonderful, is that we're teaching comics in medical schools. And the reason why, the most important reason why, is, again, what I said before, that the voice of the person experiencing it is being heard. So, for example, I talk about Sarah's Tangles. If my student is reading, my medical student is reading Tangles, right, about living with a mom with Alzheimer's and what's that like for the family, they're going to approach that patient with Alzheimer's in a different way. They're going to speak differently to the family. There's an amazing story that I've shown at Mayo Clinic in that book about just, giving your mom a bath and the experience of that. It's not a story they're going to hear in a visit with a patient, but they can experiencing it through that. And they can't universalize that if that was just, your mother, but they can start asking better questions and also realize that they shouldn't be making any kinds of assumptions. Your comic spoke to that so well. People making assumptions about what's most important in your life.
Right.
How about you just ask? Right?
Well, and then to be able to share the book and say, this is what's going on. I know, not to toot my own horn, but I've gotten lots of email response from Marbles, and it's been really, really satisfying to have people say, I shared this with my spouse and now I feel like he understands. And psychiatrists saying, I feel like I understand my patient better. or the reader saying, you really told my story, and this is what I share with people when I try to explain myself. So it's answering to that exactly, like...
Sort of translating to someone who can read it on that level.
Right.
That they can they're automatically going to subjectify it, even though, like, I think there's something about images that people place themselves in. The theory that Scott McCloud talks about in not understanding comics, but understanding comics.
Right.
That you can just draw a circle with two eyes in it and a line, and people will identify with it. And even though we're using really specific styles, each of us or whatever, there's something that clicks in a way that almost nothing else does for people.
Right.
Can I open up to questions you have for anybody? Let's see you first.
I was wondering, I tend to either go to streams of wrapping up, as far as a survivor narrative of either yay, well that's over, this horrible thing's over, and now everything's awesome. Or oh, everything's terrible, the end. And so I was wondering neither of which people do tend to that was all done, now I'm great. People do respond well to that, but I don't like that, and it's not very representative, And then everything's still terrible is not very well. Yeah. Anyways, I was just wondering how we find a happy medium and a truthful way to write about the reality of especially if something's ongoing, but still bring some sort of conclusion.
Well, I think there's a lot of thoughts come to my mind. One is, I think what you just said right there is exactly what you do, right? There's an amazing graphic novel.
The last one.
Called Lighter Than My Shadow, about living with anorexia and sexual abuse. And that's, what you just described is exactly where it is. It's still always going to be there. You don't have, I'm not a huge fan of narrative resolution. And actually, there's all kinds of theory about, what the role of story in medicine. There's a guy called Arthur Frank who talks a lot about the kinds of stories we tell in healthcare. And so there's all kinds of, if you're interested, lots of work. And again, this is what one of the things narrative medicine does, medical literature in medicine, looks at those kinds of questions. And it's fascinating. But to my mind, telling your story just the way you said it,
that's why doing comics in small, issues is good too. Because you could just, a lot of people in zine culture don't expect it to resolve at the end.
That is what I do. I still have that issue.
You have issues. Is that what?
I do write small issues of zines, but I still have that problem.
But you still have the problem of do I wrap it up at the end of that issue, or
there will always be more issues?
So to speak.
That works on both levels.
It's what I do too. There's no cure, and so at the end it's so I'm relatively I'm stable, but it's always relatively stable, and here are the things that I do to take care of myself. And basically I'm okay. Yeah. So
and
it's
Rupert. Your book seems like it could get bigger and bigger and bigger. How do you know when to stop? How do you know when this story, since there's so many stories, is at a close?
Well, it's an interesting question because, as I said, I've been working on it for so long, and at one point, I thought, when I turned 50, I thought perfect, because I love those rounded numbers. I thought, okay, the first 50 years, that'd be great. Well, that was 10 years ago now. So it could be an ongoing thing, but at some point, I just have to, figure that the essential things I wanted to share with people are within the first 50 years. So it didn't take much for me to realize when there was kind of a natural end to it.
Mm-hmm. And there's a great quote about art. I think it was Picasso, but I'm probably totally making this up. It's something like it's never really done. It just stops in interesting places. Right. So.
And I think more and more people are starting to just getting interested in people's stories. I mean, even like Fun Home has got so many different stories in it, and you can almost start in different places. And of course, she has her trajectory, and everything is in its place, in its right place. But then there was the other story she had to tell because she realized her mother didn't feature as prominently. It was more like the father story than the mother story, you know. And then there might be a part 3 or something. And I think that the cool thing about comics is people are so entertained by reading comics that they'll allow for a non-traditional narrative to like exist, I think, readers. But other questions? Yeah.
I have a question, but I first just wanted to say that I would hate it that if everybody just left this room and we all didn't find out who else in the room is doing comics. That either who is here because you identify this topic you're doing comics or you're doing comics about this. I would love to know.
Show of hands or something?
Yeah.
Who does comics in this
I was
room?
going to say that.
Oh my God.
Who does disability comics?
Who does disability
That's because
comics?
it's interesting.
Who
Well, then we would have
who
to go
works with
and
art and disability.
Define disability.
And
Yeah,
who works
yeah.
with, you know, like maybe deal. Yeah, exactly.
Less-
Like
But you just said define disability, so actually that has to do with my question.
Mm.
So you hit on this bit when you're talking about crazy earlier. There are so many different terms out there, and everybody has different feelings about what those terms mean. And I'm wondering how each of you have grappled with talking about this and being able to use the language that matters to you while being sensitive to how other people react to that language.
Anybody want to start?
I figure that language is about communication, and so it's just sort of like gauging what that means somewhere in the middle. I mean, I would have to do a little bit of like kind of putting things together. I've never really considered myself having a disability, really specifically. But I've talked at disability conferences, and here, like disability, it makes sense to me. But it's not really a term that I would attach. But I understand that the meaning is the same. So I think it's kind of like comics terminology. It's kind of all over the place. There are some cartoonists that are like graphic novels. That's bullshit. You know, like I'm a cartoonist, but we don't do cartoons. We do comics.
I know, and then when you say
cartoons
you're
are like gag
cartoonist, they think
cartoons
of
or
the
animation.
Yeah.
So it's about communication. Really, it's just about being sort of like being aware of what it is that we're talking about and doing, like for me, doing my best to navigate that. And if there, one of the things that you wrote us an email about, like, are there terms that you're not comfortable with or that you don't want to refer to yourself? And I really appreciated that. I think I'm probably on the not as sensitive to certain terms as a lot of people are, but I totally understand that. I know when I was first diagnosed, I was very sensitive to all the times anybody said anything was insane or crazy, like very sensitive to that. And I just, like I've come to a different place with that. So everybody has a lot of different definitions and sensitivities. And so it's just kind of, that would be where I land on that.
I really bucked the term mentally ill for a long time, just because I didn't like how it sounded. And then for a while there, I started reading more and more like articles in the newspapers with the mentally ill, it was almost like they were othering people to this extent that I wanted to start identifying that way again so that people knew there were people, so that people didn't think they had an idea of then who the mentally ill were or what they looked like or how they were going to act. And that's why I think a lot of this stuff is changing. It reminds me of queer sphere. Like, I don't know if I should come out as crazy around certain people. I don't know if I should come out as queer around certain people. I have similar stuff with my personal spiritualities. How much I share with people and what words I use. And it's hard because it is a lot of code switching. I don't often put like the word crazy in writing unless I explain it a lot. But I could say it to somebody and they can look at me and wink and we know what we're talking about. It's interesting. I feel like it's also for mental illness and mental health issues to be grouped with chronic illness and disability is a new sort of rapidly burgeoning social justice network, kind of. And that's a big deal because when I was just sort of zining about crazy and getting and feeling really reactionary and stuff, I didn't feel like there was that big of a community to nestle in. And within that community are people that don't want this word used and don't want that. And so really it's about sharing experience, and it's about learning from other people's experience, and just comics being an incredible way to convey what it is you're trying to say.
So in queer comics right now, we're having a conversation about moving from queer narratives to like genre comics with queer characters in them, to moving like not calling queer comics a genre itself. Mm-hmm. In the same way, a lot of you folks talked about kind of comics about the medical or disabled or less able experience. Do you have a picture of what it is outside of those narratives, like what people are doing in superhero, sci-fi, other kind of comics? Are there successes happening in those fields right now, or are we still kind of behind?
I think you're reminding me a little bit of Rupert and I were having a conversation before we got here about, because you were saying a little bit, well, my content isn't exactly medical content and stuff. And then I was asked, I mean, I didn't say this specifically when in the email, but I was thinking of your superheroes and the way that you just recently said, Diva was this aspect of your life and Brown Bomber was this aspect of your life. And can you maybe answer the question, how you feel about it's almost like fictionalizing. Are you sort of asking about how we can work with fiction?
Yeah, well, I'm asking because there's obviously a lot of cartoonists in here, and everyone wants to represent a diverse, field of people.
And then how to do it in genres that aren't just autobio and stuff like that. Do you have an opinion on that, Rupert? Just as somebody who read superhero comics and drew superheroes at first, yeah.
Well, what I would say is that one of the reasons I really wanted to do the panel was I knew that I was invited here to get my own perspective. And my feeling is that I just soon give it and then lean back. And I knew that I would be really interested in what the other panelists had to say, because I knew they were operating in a whole different world than I am. All I could say to the question is that I just think that it's really wonderful the different places this medium is branching out. The idea, this is the first time I've known of your work, and the whole idea that you can make so much information accessible to people through this medium is an incredibly honorable thing. The direction I've taken is pretty much because as a kid I was so enamored of superhero comics. And what I ended up creating was something that was very bizarre, in that I so held onto this idea of creating superhero kinds of characters, yet I had this way of looking at the world that would make me kind of better as an editorial cartoonist. So what I felt I ended up doing was I just mushed all of these genres together and ended up with something that I don't really know that there's that much out there like what I've done. I do know that I was very heavily influenced by Doonesbury. So in a way, I always feel as if what I've created is a bit of Doonesbury, a bit of the superhero comics, and a bit of Peanuts, and a bit of Archie and Jughead. So it's all of these influences came together, and I think the beautiful thing that I think we all can do as creative people. We have total license to do that. We could just create whatever we want to create. And every time it happens, it's exciting to me. I mean, this is stunning. I'm just blown away by the way you've been able to use your artistry.
We got a hand.
I'm interested in doing comic books on aging, and so I think, MK, that might speak to you and the unit that you worked in. There's not a lot of us over 60, but there's enough. So if anyone's interested in doing that or talking to me about that, I'm really interested. And also in the conference in Toronto. I wonder if maybe you can speak about that.
And I think we got 2 minutes. Is it ending at 1:15? Yeah, 2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to you separately, but the conference is in Riverside, California this year. Yeah, Toronto was last year and 2 years ago. And it's in Riverside, California, July 16th to 18th, University of California, Riverside. And you can go to graphicmedicine.org and click on conferences and get all the information and register.
And I want to read all the comics by all the ages. I want to know what it's like. I want to know what your experience
you
is.
say that phrase, what it's like, and that's the critical thing that we found is that that's the most important piece of information to communicate is what it's like.
Yeah.
That's it.
And as far as like,
Thank you.